The World Soul Saga and the Last Titan is perfectly set up to wrap up World of Warcraft in the grand finale of the series. We will deal with the entire villain roster of World of Warcraft, the Warlords, the Titans, Lights, Sargeras. We will see all the big characters we know of, Illidan, Anduin, Thrall, and we will deal with the World Soul of Azeroth, the biggest thing of the series, essentially saving the planet. After this is done, no one is really left from the known lore for us to fight in the future. Luckily on BlizzCon, Blizzard did say that the saga is only the start of the next 20 years of Warcraft, but realistically the way they went kinda all in on this project gives them two absolute options depending on player growth and performance. If Warcraft declines, they can just wrap it up and call it a day. If it grows, they have to come up with brand new lore for another saga. So could The Last Titan really be the final WoW expansion, and what could we expect to see for the future of the game? If you want to get Dragonflight or anything else Warcraft related, Gamigo has some excellent deals that you can check out with my link below. Best of all, you can get software, gift cards, a bunch of games at below market prices. On top of that, you can also use my code Doron to get yet another discount, so make sure to check out my link below and grab some amazing deals at Gamigo. If you really look into the World Soul Saga, you will realize that Blizzard is really just going all in and wrapping up all the lore that is currently available. We already know the concepts for the next 3 expansions, we can pretty accurately predict who is going to be involved in each of them and how it is roughly going to play out, and essentially we are ending the storyline of all the big villains that we know of in the Warcraft universe, which naturally gets a lot of people wondering if this really could be the end of World of Warcraft as we know it. Realistically, the lore of Warcraft was never really built for the MMORPG. I mean, this is something Blizzard had addressed on many occasions. Originally, it started as a pretty simple orc versus human storyline, then we got quite a bit of nuance in Warcraft 3, a lot of new races, but in all reality, Blizzard kinda ran out of most of Warcraft 3 lore by the end of Wrath of the Lich King. I mean, they admitted to this recently themselves. That is when we dealt with Illidan, Arthas, Scourge, Lich King, Kel'Thas, pretty much all the big Warcraft 3 players, and then Blizzard reverted to some older lore to bring back Deathwing. Then in Mists of Pandaria, they had essentially invented an entire new continent, entirely new lore that was based on like one NPC back from Warcraft 3. Then in Worlds of Draenor, they did a throwback to Warcraft 1, but they kind of went crazy with the time travel and the focus on the orcish part of the Warcraft series. Now, you may be thinking, I mean, the Warcraft lore as we know it kind of ended with Sargeras and WoW Legion, and that is kind of correct, but keep in mind, if you followed the lore for a really long time, you might remember that Sargeras wasn't really that big of a deal. He was mainly a footnote at the start of World of Warcraft, and then they really played into him as the big bad guy for Legion, and for the longest time, he was like this main huge villain of the Warcraft universe, like this is one single bad guy that all of us knew we will eventually deal with. We also kind of had the old gods as a parallel at the same time as well, but this is also a great example of Warcraft 3 characters that were really turned into big villains later on to make the story work, as back in the RTS they were literally just some hidden horror in Northrend, but not really a big deal. Like the Lich King was a much bigger deal. Now Blizzard realized that they can't really go further anywhere from this, so they came out with the Chronicle that really expanded the cosmological forces to set the ground for a lot more expansions, and they created the entire storyline that will be wrapping up in the World Soul Saga. That is when they heavily expanded upon the Titans, the World Soul of Azeroth started being a thing, later the Pantheon of Death, Elune, and that is when they really introduced the Warlords as one of the big villains of the Warcraft universe. You can even tell this happened later because Dimensius, the All Devouring, like one of the big Voidlords, was a tiny minion back in TBC. Later in the Chronicle, he was written as one of the most powerful guys in the entire cosmos. Lore-wise, it makes sense. I mean, he was a tiny manifestation on Outland, but it is obvious that this wasn't the original plan. I mean, if they figured the Voidlords as the ultimate Warcraft villains back in PvC, they definitely wouldn't have just added him as a quest villain in Outland. If you guys followed the lore for the longest time, you can see this was a huge trend that happened over the years. For example, the old gods were originally created to be potentially the biggest villains of the Warcraft universe, like actual gods of the entire cosmos, and then later they were retconned as just the tools of the Void Lords, so no one really super important, and even old gods exist over other planets. However, here comes the big finale, and that is the fact that this entire gigantic cosmological storyline that Blizzard had seeded around the time of Legion with the Chronicle is obviously going to come to an end in the World Soul Saga, and we are quite literally just going to run out of villains. Just look at the data we have. We will deal with the old gods and the remnants through Xal'atath, we will deal with the Light and the Naru, we will deal with the Shadow and the Void Lords, and ultimately we will deal with the Titan Pantheon that recently started being bad guys. Very likely we will also deal with the Death Force to Denatrius. We're most certainly going to see the involvement of Sargeras and Illidan, and it seems like we're really going to deal with the World Soul of Azeroth in the finale and potentially awakening Azeroth, which could be ending everything. Seriously, by all the info, the only thing we might not see by the end of the saga are the first ones that they had just introduced in the Shadowlands, but they're just super vague to begin with. So taking all this into account, by the time the last Titan is finished, essentially the entire roster of WoW villains will disappear like all the big guys, and naturally this brings a lot of people to question whether this really is the end of World of Warcraft as we know it. Now the good news is the BlizzCon information. As you may remember, Chris Metzen said that the World Soul Saga is just the start, and that since 2024 is the 20th anniversary of World of Warcraft, they are with this saga setting up the next 20 years of Warcraft. And while that may be really exciting news at first glance, I think there is a lot more nuance to this statement, and I think it's not really that simple. It is no secret that World of Warcraft has definitely fell off over the years. I mean, even the most hardcore fan can admit this, and this is of course, I mean, completely natural for a game that has been lasting for 20 plus years. Blizzard has obviously stopped reporting the player numbers that they used to do all the time, but let's just say at the moment we are definitely far off from the peak of 12 million active players. And for the old school people, you might remember that Warcraft back in the day was like crazy popular, like super mainstream, and everyone and their mother knew about it. I mean, the game today is still big, it's still popular, but it is a lot more niche in the entire gaming sphere than it used to be like 10-15 years ago. My most honest opinion is that the World Soul Saga project is a huge experiment, and it is really set up as a do or die type thing depending on how the game is going to perform in the next 5 or 6 years. If the game doesn't get more players and becomes less profitable for your company, they can perfectly set it up to essentially wrap up all the lore, deal with all the big villains, save Azeroth, and just end it all and just keep the game on maintenance. However, in the case it grows, they can also set it up to deal with all the big villains, and then they would have to get to work to come up with a brand new storyline that would emerge from the ones that we currently have. This is also one of the reasons they had only roughly outlined what will be happening and why they had for the first time ever told us about 3 expansions in advance, which was really crazy because they want us to know that they're going all in, and they told us on BlizzCon they are really going all in. I don't think they even know right now how the storyline is going to go, and they're kind of winging it depending on the profitability. You gotta keep in mind, if they really go hard on the characters and just delete them, they will essentially deplete the entire pool of villains that they currently have and big characters. Realistically, from this perspective, the only thing they can do is to expand more on the first ones and how the 6 cosmological forces are not that big of a deal, and they can go even crazier on the cosmology, or have the entire other side of Azeroth. But really, how many times can we really discover hidden continents on Azeroth? Like, when are we actually going to explore this planet? The good news though is that if WoW does well, which personally I think it will, they can kind of vaguely end a lot of the minions. Like, we don't have to destroy the Void or the Light in Midnight, we can only temporarily stop it so that after the World Soul Saga we can really go into a full-on Void invasion or a Void expansion that isn't actually based on Azeroth. We could also not destroy the Titans, we could have an entire expansion on some Titan homeworld that could be entirely new content that we never heard about. Even with the characters like Illidan, they had recently foreshadowed that borders of the Emerald Dream exist that could potentially be crossed, so they got some wiggle room in this entire material dream elemental plane that kind of exists parallel to the one we are in. Also, we always got time travel with alternate realities. We could get alternate Azeroth like how we got alternate Draenor, but personally, I'm not sure if I really want to see that, as really that is a whole different can of worms that if they open it, it can't really go back. However, I do think depending on the hype and the performance and the profitability of the game, the Worlds of Saga is potentially the finale of World of Warcraft. It is perfectly set up to end the entire Warcraft series if they can no longer profitably push the game, but at the same time, if it does well, they got a ton of wiggle room to seed new lore for at least another saga or two. Thank you for watching. Check out the Lost Human Kingdom, you'll soon discover by clicking on the screen, and check out my video on ancient Greek colonies in Spain by clicking on the screen as well. See you next time.